and I'm going to be presenting my work in progress on in-work poverty in London, with the aim of that work being to eventually publish a sort of research briefing on the issue. So in terms of outline for today, I'm just going to briefly define a few uh, concepts just to ground the discussion and just make the case for why it matters to study in-work poverty in London. I will then show the results proper, the trend and drivers in in-work poverty in London, the different impacts by socio-demographic groups, and also a focus at the end on issues of poverty and family size and benefits. I'll then wrap up with a quick summary and a few examples of potential implications for policy. And I very much see this as a two-way process. The presentation is definitely not going to take the whole hour. It'll be more like 25 minutes, 30 minutes max. And I'd obviously, while I'm very happy to do this to share my results, I'd also love to hear about colleagues in terms of what they find useful in this type of research, what they find less useful, what they may be interested in exploring further. So very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that. So just a bit of housekeeping to start with and definitions to ground the discussion. Not going to go into any technical details, but just to say that I'm using a definition of poverty that we call relative poverty, which is the most commonly used definition, which considers that someone is in poverty if their household income, net income falls below 60% of the median after paying for housing costs. So the in-work poverty rate can be defined as the share of working age people who are in employment and who live in a household in poverty. But there is no single official definition, at least in the UK, as far as I'm aware, of in-work poverty. And as I'll make clear throughout the presentation, I think there's a reason for that. It's because to understand the links between work and poverty, we need to study a range of indicators between working age poverty, labour force participation, and household circumstances. I also just want to flag from the get-go that this measure of poverty that I'm using is just one of the many different ways of looking at poverty, and there are things that it does well and others that it does not do so well. Essentially, when we say that someone is in poverty if their income is below 60% of the median, that is a measure of how much the lower incomes in society keep up with the middle. It's almost a measure of inequality, if you want. And it's bound to change over time to some extent because it changes, for instance, if the median income rises, and median incomes do tend to rise over time. So this measure is a good way, I think, of keeping track of how much the people who earn less cope compared to the rest of society. It does not say much, however, about, for instance, absolute poverty. So if you think about the poverty line as defined by the World Bank, that's an absolute threshold that they define in terms of what the basic necessities to live are. That is not in relation to anyone else in your society. It does not say much about the depth of poverty. The depth of poverty is how much the income of the very bottom of distribution is. You know, if you study people below 60% of median income, that'll include people earning 59% of the median and people earning 5% of the median. And here, I'm not really distinguishing between these. And also, it does not say much about actual material deprivation, concrete essential items that people may not be able to afford. All of these are limitations that I wanted to emphasize to start with, because I think they're important to keep in mind, and also to say that they're not necessarily contradictory. They would make for very useful further research, I think. So why should we study in-work poverty in London? So London's poverty rate was 25% in the latest report from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, representing 2.2 million people across the capital. And it's higher than the UK average of 22%. But at the same time, many London labour market indicators are in a pretty good shape. You know, the employment rate in London is higher than in the UK on average. There's never been more payrolls, resident employee jobs in London. And so I really think it's this contrast between the apparent health of the labour market and the high poverty rates that mean we should understand better the links between labour market participation and poverty. Also, there are many examples of negative social outcomes associated to poverty that academic research has put forward, including educational inequality, health issues and pressure on the NHS, violent youth crime. So many reasons to want to understand poverty better. So in terms of the results themselves, here in this graph, each bar represents the overall poverty rate for the 16 to 64 resident population in London. And then I break it down in two parts. I break it down between people in poverty who live in a workless family and people in poverty who live in a family where at least one adult is employed. So if you just look at the overall bars for now, you can see that the overall poverty rate in London has been pretty stable in the long run. There are short-term fluctuations, but if you look at the overall period, it sort of remains between 20 and 25% of Londoners. It may fluctuate due to economic circumstances. So, there's a peak around the global financial crisis, but it is roughly always between 20 and 25%. What has really changed is the composition of that group of people in poverty. At the start of the period studied, 96, 97, the bar part, the blue part of the bar is bigger than the pink one. That means that most people in poverty at that time are from a workless household. And that has just changed over time. Increasingly, you see the pink gaining ground. And today, most people who live in poverty in London live in a family in which at least there is one person in employment. I think it's important to understand that because that's a big change in circumstances for any poverty strategies that we would want to devise today. Poverty has very much shifted from being associated to household worklessness to being associated to households where there is employment. Now, to get into the heart of the indicator itself, the in-work poverty indicator, that is the share of workers in poverty. This is the latest data. So 15% of people with a job in London in the latest data available were in poverty. That's just under 700,000 workers in London. If you look at how that changed over time, it's definitely sort of risen since the mid-90s. It is higher now than the mid-90s, but it sort of peaked in the middle of the last decade. And since then, it's been falling slightly and then stabilizing for reasons that I'm not entirely quite sure of yet, that I think would be worth exploring. So when we talk about in-work poverty, a key thing is trying to understand the type of work, actually, because the realities are very different depending on the type of work people do. And, there's so many characteristics of work we could delve into. Here, I just look at very simple characteristics. It's whether people are employees or self-employed, and amongst employees, whether they are full-time or part-time employees. So the blue line at the bottom is the share of full-time employees in London who are in poverty. As you can see, it is much lower than the two other lines. It's also much lower than the 15%, well, not much lower, but lower than the 15% figure that I gave in the previous slide. It is not insignificant. 1 in 10 full-time employees in London are in poverty. I find that still quite striking, but it remains nonetheless a much better form of employment when it comes to protecting against poverty. On the other hand, the poverty risks associated to self-employment are much higher. So the poverty risk of self-employed worker in the latest data was around 24%. It's been broadly trendless over time with regards to self-employment. There's like fluctuations in the short term, but generally, again, it's always between 20 to 25%. The poverty risk of part-time employee is also much higher than for full-time employee. It's nearly 30% of part-time employees in London are in poverty. And now what is quite striking is that this has actually changed a bit over time. It used to be closer to 20% at the start of the decade. So at the start of the period studies, sorry. So in the space of less, just under 3 decades, the poverty risk of part-time employees has risen by 10 percentage points. And very much the rise of in-work poverty is driven by the poverty risk of part-time employees over time. And therefore, this prompted me to look more into what type of jobs do resident Londoners have and what type of jobs have been created in London. And what I want to emphasize here is that the story of rising in-work poverty, it's not a story of, we're just creating precarious jobs, because that's not entirely true. It's more that we create the jobs that are being created really polarize. On the one hand, if you look at the pink bar on the left-hand chart, you see the rise in the full-time employee jobs over time that have done, as I said, a pretty good job at protecting people against poverty. At the very top of that chart, there is the rise in all the jobs that are not full-time employee. There is part-time employee and self-employment. And you can see that the rise has basically been even. There's been a very similar rise in workers in these full-time employee jobs and in these more precarious, not full-time or self-employed jobs. So it's very much this polarization of type of work that's been created that I want to flag here. Maybe a worrying trend here is that the category that has risen the most in percentage terms is part-time self-employed. And obviously, that's slightly worrying because that accumulates two forms of potential disadvantages in the labor market. But I should also flag that it remains a very marginal forms of employment if you look at the number of workers in London. Now, there's many potential reasons why part-time work and self-employment may, on average, be associated to higher poverty risks. The academic literature will often tend to emphasize things like, self-employment leads to instability in earnings. Part-time work, obviously, because you work part-time, you're paid for fewer hours and therefore your earnings are lower. There is also a documentation in general that part-time work or self-employment tend to more commonly be found in occupations or industries that are lower paid. So these are potential reasons. But one that I really want to emphasize in the next slide is the importance of the household context in which we will find full-time work or part-time work or self-employment work. So here, if you look at the top of that graph in the pink, you've got the percentage change in number of Londoners living in workless families. And you see that has fallen over time. So what I said at the very beginning of this empirical part, that poverty is moving away from being associated to workless households and increasingly affects working households. Well, in general, workless families and households are less and less of a thing. I'm not saying they're non-existent or negligible, but they definitely have been falling in London. So I flagged that because for a long time, and especially late 90s, 2000s, a lot of poverty policies, academic research was centered around this idea that there was a divide between workless households, workless families, and working families. And what I am trying to argue here is that I think that divide is becoming less relevant. Instead, the divide is what type of work do we find in families? Most families now are working. But it's really about the type of work. And here, I'd like to contrast the very bottom blue bar and the blue bar that's a second from the top. You see that the two biggest rises in the type of families in which working Londoners live are, on the one hand, at the bottom, you see a strong rise in households where all the adults are employed in full-time employee work. So to put it very simply, all the adults are employed in good jobs. And at the top, you see a strong rise in households where the only source of labor income is part-time employee work. And I think that is really crucial to understand why the part-time employment, the poverty risks associated to part-time employment have risen. It's because in the 70s, 80s, part-time employment typically, first of all, was rarer. And when it existed, it tended to typically be a complement. It typically tended to be work that partnered women would have that would complement a job of a full-time man in a sort of very classic framework. But obviously that has changed quite a lot over time. Family structures have changed. The nature of part-time employment has changed. And so I think there's perhaps a mistake and all this. It used to be that part-time employee work wasn't associated that much to poverty, but it has really risen because increasingly it becomes the only source of labor income for many families or households. And that's a key change to understand. Okay, so now I've sort of finished the labor market parts in itself in terms of looking at the type of jobs. I wanted to then look at the unequal risk of in-work poverty in London by a few key socio-demographic characteristics. The two main forms of inequalities here that I found were in terms of ethnicity and in terms of education. And here the data, when you look at fine-grained characteristics, data is not great, which explains the break in the time series. I don't show the years where the data is not reliable enough. In terms of ethnicity, the graph on the left, unfortunately, I cannot break it down by more groups because the data was too limited for that. Nonetheless, instructive to see that there is quite a strong difference in the in-work poverty risk between white workers and Asian and Black workers, and that as far as the data allows us to infer, there doesn't seem to be a closing of that gap over time. There's also quite a strong stratification of the in-work poverty rate by education level, much higher for people who have not gone to university or have not completed the degrees compared to degree-educated workers. The gap is especially strong between people with a degree and people with no qualifications at all, and that gap has been rising quite strongly as well over time. I explored other characteristics as well, where the story is perhaps less clear cut. So by age, I appreciate there's a lot going on in that graph. What I want to emphasize from it is that for all age group, the in-work poverty risks are at least as high, and in practice for most of these groups higher now than 25, 30 years ago. I also wanted to flag that there's been the strongest rises in in-work poverty risks have been for all the groups of workers between 40 and 49 and 50 and 59. In terms of gender, we see that the in-work poverty risk has been very slightly higher for men and women over the period studied, but that also seems to be closing in the most recent years. And I must say, with regards to disability, I'm a bit puzzled by this big fluctuation. So you can see that for most of the period studied, workers with disabilities have been at higher risk of in-work poverty than workers without. But there has been a sharp rise at the start of the last decade in the in-work poverty risk of workers with disabilities, and then it has fallen very suddenly. And I must say, I haven't had the time to explore that in depth yet. I'm not entirely sure whether this is just a sort of artifact of the data, if the data has got lower quality, or if there are genuine reasons for that, maybe changes in, I don't know, benefit types or this sort of thing. So I would be curious to hear if anyone has thoughts on that or thinks it's worth exploring further. And finally, I wanted to have a little zoom on the relationship between labour market participation, poverty, and family size. And I think there's two reasons motivating that. The first one is often in the media, you may see the press, academic research over the past few decades. There's been quite a strong focus on single parenthood and the idea that being a single parent, the breakdown in supposedly classic family structure is linked to more vulnerability and poverty. And there are potential rationales for that. Single parents may be less able to work or to work full time because they have to care for their children as well. So that's a potential explanation. And I also wanted to explore the link between poverty and family size in the context of the number of children, particularly given the benefit cuts in the past decades that have affected disproportionately larger families. So here, what I want to emphasize, the graph on the left is very much meant to ground the discussion. What we see is that single parents are a minority among working age Londoners, and quite a stable one as well. In fact, over the past 25, 30 years, we see a rise in the number of working age Londoners living in couples. The reason I want to emphasize that is to say that I think any analysis of poverty or in-work poverty that solely sort of concentrates on single parents, I think will miss a big part of the picture, which isn't to say that single parents are not vulnerable or worthy of policy attention, not at all. And in fact, I'm going to touch upon that. They are a group that's very much at risk in terms of poverty. But it's to say that they cannot account on their own for trends of poverty and in-work poverty, that there are many other things going on that I think, as I said earlier in the presentation, are very much related to the way we find precarious form of work being the sole source of labour income, including in couples. If you look at the poverty risks, it is true that single parents, so this is the general poverty risk, not the in-work poverty, just general poverty. Single parents are at much higher risk of poverty than other types of households. But it's also worth noting that this poverty risk has decreased quite sharply over time. And that is partly linked to the increase in the employment rate of single parents. They used to have a very strong unemployment to worklessness rate. The employment rate has risen quite sharply, and part of it has led to more in-work poverty for single parents. So there are a substantial number of single parents who have gone onto the labour market and have not been lifted out of poverty despite finding employment. But there are also some for whom employment lifted them out of poverty, which is why even though the in-work poverty rate of single parents has risen over time with the employment rate, their overall poverty rate has still decreased, but it remains quite high. The other thing that I find quite striking from this graph is that if you abstract from whether, the number of adults, whether it's a couple, whether it's single, for a given number of adults, the poverty rate rises quite sharply as soon as children appear. So single parents are much higher risk of poverty than single childless people. Couples with children are also at higher risk of poverty than couples without. And that prompted me to explore poverty risk by family size, especially in the context of recent benefit cuts, especially the two-child limit on universal credit child payments that started from 2017 onwards. The link between family size and poverty is interesting because the size of the family seems to matter in terms of the labor market participation of family. So families, just to simplify, I'm going to call families with 3 children or more larger families, they tend to have a lower labor market attachment. They have a slightly more higher rate of full family worklessness than other family types. They also tend to have lower rates of a lower number of families where all the adults are employed. So they tend to have essentially lower employment than other family types. They also are much more reliant on benefits. And so if you look at the graph on the left, this combination, explains why they have a poverty rate that has been consistently higher than families with fewer children. But what is interesting here is the divergence of trends. So in the second half of the 2010s, while the poverty rate of family with 1 or 2 children decreases and in fact converges down towards the poverty rate of childless families, the poverty risk for people living in families with 3 children or more increases just around that time. And I think the picture is even more striking if you zoom in on the poverty rate of families that receive benefits specifically. Because here, so I'm looking at any form of benefits that families can claim. And, before the sort of time of the introduction of the 2-child limit, especially in the last decade, there's not a super clear picture. But as soon as that 2-child limit appears in the data, you see this clearly diverging trend for families receiving benefits with 3 children or more, where their poverty rate suddenly becomes very distinct, increases and becomes very distinct from the rest. So here I can't claim causality. I can't say it's been caused by the 2-child gap, but I think the divergence in trend and the temporal coincidence gives such a strong hint that it can be related. Finally, and I'll just concentrate on the graph on the right here in the interest of time, I just wanted to say that even the combination of working and receiving benefits for families, for many, is not enough to lift them out of poverty. If you look at the pink line here, I'm looking only at adults living in families claiming benefits, and 43% of these adults in the latest data were in poverty, despite the fact that at least one person was employed and that the families were receiving benefits. A few just consequences very quickly of poverty and potential extensions of what we can do to this work. First of all, to say that most children in poverty these days live in a family where at least one adult is in work. So child poverty is very much to be understood in the context of in-work poverty, and any strategy aiming to deal with child poverty today will necessarily have to be very different to the one that New Labour devised when they arrived at a time where poverty was very much linked to household worklessness. Second, and here the data is still a bit sketchy, so don't draw too much conclusions from it, but I just wanted to say that in the latest data that I had, 1 in 3 adults that used a food bank in the last month were in a family where at least one person was employed. So while the vast majority of food bank users were from workless families, it's still nearly 1 in 3 that came from a family where at least one adult was in work. So to summarize, 15% of London workers are in poverty. That has been rising over time, and more Londoners in poverty live in a family with at least one person employed than in a workless family. The rise in work poverty is associated to forms of work that depart from full-time employee work, especially self-employment and or part-time work. Employment growth has been polarizing between, and to put it very simply, quote-unquote good and bad jobs, which is a huge oversimplification, but it's useful to understand generally what has been going on. And further, families have been polarizing between those that access these good jobs and those solely relying or mainly relying on the bad jobs as sources of labor income. Ethnic minorities and people with no educational qualification are at much higher risk of in-work poverty than white workers and workers with degree-level education. And benefits do not lift one out of poverty, even when combined with work. Larger families have been especially vulnerable in the context of the two-child universal credit limit. There's many examples of policy implications to finish with. I just wanted to mention two that are very practical. The first one, very important, is that often when we design a program or policy intervention to help precarious people, we may think that we need, for instance, to help the low pay, to help with pay progression. I just wanted to flag here that low pay and poverty are very different concepts. It is very possible to be low paid and not be in poverty, because poverty is a household concept. So you can be low paid because, I don't know, to take a very complete caricature, you're working in a job that you know doesn't pay well. It's your because it's your passion and you're working freelance, but your partner is a billionaire. So you're low paid, but you're not in poverty. But on the other hand, you can be not low paid and in poverty if you think of someone that has a decent hourly wage, but can only work a few hours a week because of caring responsibilities. So there's very different target populations. In-work poverty can also be fought with good, well-designed adult education policies. There's evidence for that in research, and I think that's obviously important in the London context with the devolution of skill. Thank you very much.